Welcome back to the Tool Crib. Today we're going to be looking at a long-time retired multi-tool, and that is the Kershaw A100C. Now before I get into this, I want to say a special thanks to one of my subscribers who sent me this multi-tool for me to review it. I really appreciate it, sir. Thank you for entrusting me with your equipment. Now, the Kershaw A100C was actually the very first locking plier multi-tool that ever came to market. Now, since it came out in 1997, there have been about 5 or 6 different versions, as well as a couple of knockoff versions of locking plier multi-tools. But this was actually the very first one. And actually, there's a couple of features on here that the Kershaw was really first in that we're going to highlight here momentarily. So let's get into the specs of this thing real quick. The overall weight on this multi-tool is 8.78 ounces, 8.78. Or about 246 grams. The overall length is 6 3/4 of an inch long, so it's quite long at about 171 millimeters. It's 1 1/4 inch wide, or about 32 millimeters, and the thickness is 3/4 of an inch, or 19 millimeters in overall thickness. Well, let's get into the features and functions of the A100C, and I'm going to show you what I think it really, in a couple of different ways, it was really ahead of its time. There's some things on it I really like, and then there's other things that I don't care for quite as much. But I'll let you be the judge of it. Let's get into it. We'll see what the A100C is all about. We're going to start with the outside features on here. So first and foremost, this is locking plier version of a multi-tool. Now what it has is it has this secondary catch, or the secondary holdback mechanism, which will lock in, and this is going to aid you on when we get to the interior tools. You'll see what I'm talking about. So this is actually a secondary lock, and it does have a detent here, so you can actually pivot it around and lock it in the frame so that when you're using the pliers, it's up and out of your way. Now, one of the features that this multi-tool has on it is it has this release bar. That is really well engineered, actually. I really like that it has that release bar. Now, one thing I will tell you, I've used this a couple times, and if you're gripping onto something, you really have it crimped down really hard, that can be a little cumbersome because it kind of digs into your thumb when you're trying to release it, depending on how much pressure you have on the pliers themselves. So beneficial in some ways, and can be a little cumbersome in others. Now, before we get into the pliers, I want to highlight the frame stamping here. Now, while the ruler on here is not very long, I will say that they did an outstanding job on the stamping of this. They're very crisp and very clear on the stamping. So it's only 3 inches long, and they've only got it stamped out to about 70 millimeters, which in actuality would come out to about 74 or 75 millimeters. Not the greatest ruler, but it's very, very well stamped. I will give it that. Now, if we release it, we'll look at the needle nose portion of the pliers. Now, to my knowledge, the only other multi-tool in a locking plier version that ever had a true needle nose plier was the Schrade version, and it's been a long time since I've seen it, so this may be the only true needle nose, but I think the Schrade also came down to a very sharp point as well. Few things on this plier that I like. First and foremost is, much like the Leatherman Crunch, has the little pin vise in here, and that is very helpful if you're grabbing onto a little rod or little bar or whatever, and you need to grab onto it lengthwise. That prevents it from, as you're twisting or turning it, from it sliding and slipping around the pliers. Very, very good feature on those. Something I really like. The serrated pattern on the needle nose themselves is very well done, very nicely done, matter of fact. Now, on the regular pliers, it's a little different than what you're going to find in standard multi-tools. First off, it's very long, the pattern here, and it's not quite as rounded or radius like you're going to get in some other multi-tools, apart from just regular, multi-tools, or their vice grip, or excuse me, their locking plier version of multi-tools. Now, it does not come with a hardwire cutter, but it does come with a very long soft wire cutter, which we're going to try out here in a little while. I really like the fact that it has a really long soft wire cutter in there. Now, the one feature that really made this ahead of its time, and like I mentioned before, it came out in 1997, so this is a full year ahead of the Leatherman Wave, the original Leatherman Wave, and it was a full 2 years ahead of the Leatherman Crunch. But this was actually the first multi-tool that came out with an outside accessible knife blade. Now, some people, certain functions are key to them in a multi-tool, whether that be they have to have scissors. Some people like out the front pliers. I'm a big proponent of having an outside accessible blade. It's one of the reasons why I gravitate towards the Leatherman Surge as opposed to the Victorinox Swiss tool, which I also think is an excellent multi-tool. But because the Swiss tool does not have a one-handed outside accessible blade, I find myself leaning towards the Surge more because it's a feature that's important to me. Well, this was the very first one that came out with one. What I like about it, first of all, they actually have a pressed ball detent in here. So when it's in its closed position, it locks into the detent on the blade itself, which might be a little tough to see. It's right down here, but it seats very well and doesn't slip out. Because it has a ball in there, a pressed ball detent, then it really has a smooth action. I don't particularly care for the fact that it's a combo blade though, and that's strictly because I am not a big fan of combo blades. I do like the length on this knife blade though. At 2 3/4 of an inch long in overall length, it's really quite nice actually. On larger multi-tools, I especially, when you get into wave, surge categories, I really like to have the knife blades out there at least 2.5 inches and preferably closer to 3 inches. And at 2 3/4, this comes in just right in the sweet spot. So it's a very nice knife blade. And it also comes with an integrated thumb stud as well, where they screw thumb stud in there. Makes it very, very easy to operate. Now, if we move around to the interior tools, first tool we have out is a full dimensional Phillips. Now, one thing I will say is that this slip mechanism here, the slip joint, is not very strong. But in this particular plier, it doesn't have to be, because when you're using this, what you'll be doing is you'll be locking it back down. And then if you need that extra support, you just bring your lock bar over, and now it will not come out. So full dimensional Phillips, very nice. Has a thin shank, and then they expand it out here to give you that full headed dimensional, full 3D Phillips. Now, the next tool over, well, actually we had to pull this one up first. Next tool over is a combo tool. And I will say, I haven't used this, but I got to tell you, this is a very well designed can opener. I don't see this having any issue whatsoever. First of all, it's pretty robust for its thickness. Has a nice sharp grind edge on here. I think it'll work really, really, really well. Also doubles as a can opener, or excuse me, as a bottle opener. Can opener / bottle opener. Next tool over is a file. Now the file on here is actually pretty decent. It has a cross-cut pattern on one side, and then a single cut on the other side. I wish this file were just a bit longer. There's a reason why they couldn't make it any longer. Even though it appears that they have the space to do so, they really were limited on how long they can get. They could make it, and I will highlight that in just a moment. The file pattern on here is really quite nice. It's going to be comparable to that of probably the Super Tool 300 from Leatherman. It's not quite as good as a Victorinox file, but it's a very good file nonetheless. I do like the fact that it is full width though. It does not taper down, and so it's really quite usable. I really like that file. I think that's one of its redeeming features on this particular multi-tool. Now the next tool over is the one that probably the one I like the least. This is actually a hacksaw blade, or a portion of a hacksaw blade that was integrated into here. You can see that it has quite a bit of flex and quite a bit of movement. Not the greatest blade, and this is a type of blade that's going to wear out very, very quickly. I wish they would have integrated a wood saw in here instead and made it a little thicker, a little sharper, a little bit more robust, because this is not going to last very long. And you don't have a very long stroke on here as well, because you're up against the thumb stud here, or excuse me, the screw. So while it's okay, I just don't think it's the greatest. The next tool, the last tool in the interior tools, is going to be a standard flat driver. Now this is 1/4 inch flat driver. The grind profile on here is quite good. The only thing I wish they would have done is I wish they would have left this a little thicker on the outside edge instead of grinding it down quite as narrow as what they did. But in certain cases, it probably wouldn't work well as a screwdriver if it was a little thicker. So I think maybe they're just trying to compromise and get the most functionality out of it. Also doubles as a light duty pry bar for, stuff like opening up paint cans and stuff of that nature. So a decent set of tools on here. Let's use a couple of these functions, show you how they work. Now, I haven't personally tried this just yet. We're going to do it on camera for the first time, so hopefully I don't have to eat my words. I think that wire cutter is going to be quite good. So this is just stranded 10 gauge, and we'll see how well it functions. And if we unlock it, it does okay. It's not great. You can see that it really pinches it down quite a bit. We'll give it one more shot. Let me loosen off that release here so that we are not locking in place, and see if that makes a difference. Well, it's pretty much the same thing. So it pinches in there a little bit. Well, I guess it's not the greatest wire cutter. If they'd have made it a little bit sharper, the relief on there seems to be pretty decent. It has a great relief. I thought they were going to work well because of that, but it appears they need to be a little bit sharper. Let me try it one more time. I'm just going to loosen it off a little further here to see if that makes any difference whatsoever. We'll try it one more time. And I didn't have it pinched down quite enough. So no, it's not going to be the greatest wire cutter. It works decent. It's just not fantastic. Still leaves a little bit of copper on the edge there, and you kind of have to move it around in order to. Let me bring in a little smaller piece. This is a little piece of 12 gauge. And we're pretty much getting the same problem. So I'm going to have to eat my words a little bit. It's not the best wire cutter in the world, but it does work. Now, let's try out the locking plier version. This is 1/2 inch Schedule 40 pipe nipple. And we'll just release this off and see how well it grips on there. A little bit more. And the jaws on there really grip on tight. You can see I'm trying to flex that. I can get it to move a little bit. Finally got it to move, but actually it gripped on there really nicely. That's not bad at all. So the locking plier mechanism on there works really, really well. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you, one of the downsides to this, that something I've noticed and found out the hard way, I was trying to grip onto something a little smaller. And what happened was I had to meet my hand up in here. And because it closes down so tight, I actually got pinched by it, much like you will with something like a Leatherman Wave. That it only takes one time to learn that you need to handle a little bit differently. So I have to be real conscious when you're gripping onto something that's very narrow, that you don't have your hand in the way. You get the meat of your hand up out of the way so you don't run into that problem. Now we'll try out the little pin vise here on the end. And it's great for stuff like this. You can see it's seated in there, and I can't get that to budge at all. I love that pin vise. So this is just a little section of coat hanger that I had cut off from a previous test, and that function works quite nicely. So that is something that I really like. Now, some of the pros, first of all, the pliers themselves are going to be a pro in my book. The pin vise there works really, really well. Some of the interior tools, I like the file, I like the can opener, combo can opener, I like the screwdriver, and I like the flat screwdriver. All those tools are great. The only one I have a problem with is the hacksaw blade, and that's just merely for the fact that it's going to wear out very, very quickly, and especially today, they don't manufacture this anymore, so getting replacement parts next to impossible. Next thing I do like about it is the fact that it has that outside accessible blade. That is probably what one of the biggest selling features of this multi-tool was. So in overall, I'm going to rate this in about an A-, and it would get an A if it weren't for a couple of things. First of all, the locking pliers do not fold down compactly like you're going to find in a Leatherman Crunch. It's a little cumbersome to carry. Also, because of the amount of fasteners that they use on here, it's not the most comfortable in the hand. And unlike a Leatherman Crunch, where it will the Leatherman Crunch, when it's engaged, when you're clamping down on it, actually clamps down, or the handles are open a bit more, unlike this one where it will actually fold down, and that's what allows you to pinch on your hand. If it weren't for those features, I think it would be a lot better. I still think it's a very solid multi-tool. I think it's an A minus. And one of the biggest downfalls for this, though, when you consider this came out in 1997, and this, I've checked on the original retail price of this, and it was 99.95 or something like that, 99.75, just a tick under $100. And you're talking about 2019, where people still today will balk at a $100 multi-tool. Well, you can imagine paying for $100 for a multi-tool back then. And I can't remember for certain when the Crunch came out, but I want to say that it was about $60 or $65 originally, and that may be inaccurate, but it was not nearly as expensive as this one. The engineering behind here, is pretty good actually. So one last thing that I want to show you, and the reason they couldn't get a longer file, which I thought I was going to touch on, is because it has two springs in here. The first spring is the spring for the handle mechanism itself. It's what pulls that jaw back and gives you the spring-loaded pliers. And the second spring is actually, it's down here on the bottom. And that spring is actually the spring back for the lock bar here. So the reason they can't get a longer file in here is because the spring actually protrudes into that lock bar, and if they made it longer, it would actually contact it. So they made that tool as long as they possibly could based on how this is engineered. Well, this has been a closer look at the Kershaw A100C. I think when it came out, it was a really good multi-tool. It's unfortunate they still don't make it, because they could have refined this multi-tool to make it that much better. It did a lot of good things. It really did. It did a lot. It was a lot of firsts. The locking pliers, first of all, and then the outside accessible blade, which, like I mentioned before, a full year ahead of the Leatherman Wave. So very first one to have the outside accessible blade, very first one to have locking pliers. This has been a look at the Kershaw A100C. Hope you've enjoyed. If you did, please hit the thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.